Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Discovery as they approached the neutral space station called Concordia. The year was 2387, and this was the moment humanity had waited for since they first reached the stars. Today they would meet their first alien species face to face. The Zephyrian Empire had agreed to this meeting after months of careful radio communications across the void of space. Jake felt nervous but excited as he watched the massive station grow larger on the main screen. Ambassador Lisa Carter stood beside him wearing her best diplomatic uniform. She carried a briefcase filled with gifts from Earth and documents that could create peace between two civilizations. Behind her stood Lieutenant Ben Walsh, a young officer who had volunteered to help with the historic meeting. The Zephyrians had been discovered 3 years ago when their ships crossed into human territory near the Kepler system. At first contact had been tense because neither side knew what to expect. The aliens spoke of their great empire that controlled 17 star systems. They seemed powerful and military-minded, but they had agreed to talk instead of fight. This gave humans hope that peace was possible. As the Discovery docked with Concordia Station, Jake could see the Zephyrian ship on the other side. It was dark and angular with strange symbols carved into its hull. The design looked aggressive compared to the smooth curves of human vessels. But Jake reminded himself not to judge by appearances. Today was about building bridges between worlds. Ambassador Carter had studied everything humans knew about Zephyrian culture. They were reptilian creatures with 4 arms and scales that looked like crystals. Their society was built around military strength and honor in battle. Carter had prepared carefully for this meeting, knowing that one wrong word could start a war that humanity might not survive. The meeting room in Concordia Station was designed to be neutral territory. Half the room was set up for human comfort, with familiar chairs and lighting. The other half had been modified for Zephyrian needs with different gravity and temperature controls. In the center was a simple table where the future of both species would be decided. When the Zephyrian delegation entered the room, Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. War Marshal Krextel was larger than the reports had suggested. His crystalline scales reflected the station lights in rainbow patterns, and his 4 arms moved with practiced military precision. Behind him came 6 other Zephyrians, all wearing what looked like ceremonial armor covered in battle honors. Ambassador Carter stepped forward with a warm smile and extended her hand in the traditional human greeting. She had rehearsed this moment many times and spoke the Zephyrian words for peace and friendship that their translators had taught her. The gesture was meant to show trust and openness between equals who wanted to build a better future together. But something went terribly wrong in those first few seconds. War Marshal Krextel looked at Carter's outstretched hand, and his eyes grew wide with what looked like shock. He spoke rapidly to his companions in their native language, and Jake could see them becoming agitated. The translator devices struggled to keep up, but Jake caught words that sounded like submission and surrender. Before anyone could react, Krextel raised one of his 4 arms and made a sharp gesture. The other Zephyrians immediately drew weapons that had been hidden beneath their ceremonial armor. Red energy beams filled the air as the aliens opened fire on the surprised human delegation. Carter cried out as she was hit and fell to the floor. Ben Walsh tried to shield her, but took multiple shots to his chest. The attack lasted only seconds, but when it ended, 12 humans lay dead or dying on the floor of what was supposed to be a place of peace. Ambassador Carter was badly wounded but still alive. The Zephyrians quickly captured the survivors and began speaking of human weakness and how this proved their species was only fit to serve their empire. Jake watched helplessly from the Discovery as emergency signals flashed across his screens. The Zephyrians were jamming most communications, but one escape pod managed to break free from the station. Inside was a badly injured communications officer who had witnessed the massacre and could carry the terrible news back to Earth. As the Zephyrian ships powered up their weapons and aimed them at the Discovery, Jake realized that humanity's first contact with alien life had become a disaster that would change everything. The dreams of peaceful cooperation among the stars had died in a few seconds of violence and misunderstanding. War Marshal Krextol sent a message declaring that humans were now subjects of the Zephyrian Empire and would serve or be destroyed. Discovery barely escaped as Zephyrian ships pursued them toward the edge of the system. Jake knew that when news of this attack reached Earth, the human response would be swift and terrible. The aliens had made a fatal mistake in judging human nature. They saw the offer of friendship as weakness, but they would soon learn that human kindness came from strength, not fear. The news of the Concordia massacre reached Earth in 4 days and changed everything humanity thought they knew about their place in the galaxy. President Helen Davis stood in the emergency session of the World Council as reports came in from the sole survivor who had made it home. The images from the escape pod showed the bodies of Ambassador Carter's team scattered across the meeting room floor. Ben Walsh, barely 25 years old, had died trying to protect his wounded ambassador. General Paul Richards slammed his fist on the table as he addressed the council. The Zephyrians had 3,000 warships, according to intelligence reports. Each one was more advanced than anything in the human fleet. But Richards did not care about the odds. 12 diplomats had been murdered while trying to offer peace. The families of the dead were demanding justice, and the general agreed with them completely. President Davis knew she faced an impossible choice. War with the Zephyrian Empire would likely mean the end of human civilization. But doing nothing would send a message to every species in the galaxy that humans could be killed without consequences. She looked at the faces around the table and saw the same determination that had carried humanity through its darkest hours on Earth. Within a week, the transformation began. Factory worlds like New Pittsburgh that had been making civilian transports started building warships instead. The orbital shipyards around Titan Base worked around the clock as thousands of engineers converted peaceful designs into instruments of war. Humanity had not fought a major conflict in over a century, but the knowledge was still there waiting to be awakened. Dr. Amanda Foster led the CRASH program to develop new weapons that could match Zephyrian technology. Her team worked 18-hour days in underground laboratories, pushing the limits of human science and engineering. They created plasma mines that could pierce alien shields and stealth fighters that moved like shadows through space. But their greatest achievement was the Rage Protocol, an artificial intelligence system that could predict enemy tactics by studying their psychological patterns. The first human strike came 6 months after Concordia. Commander Ryan Brooks led a small fleet of the new stealth ships against the Zephyrian listening posts on the edge of their territory. The aliens never saw them coming. Brooks used tactics from old Earth wars, hitting fast and disappearing before the enemy could respond. The Zephyrian commanders had expected formal fleet battles like they fought with other species. They were not prepared for human unconventional warfare. News of the attack spread through Zephyrian space like wildfire. The aliens had thought humans were weak creatures who could be easily conquered. Now they discovered that the species they had dismissed as inferior was striking back with weapons and tactics they had never encountered before. Fear began to creep into Zephyrian military reports as more outposts fell to human raids. The liberation of Kepler Station became humanity's first major victory. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Martinez led a boarding action that freed not only the captured human diplomats, but hundreds of enslaved aliens from other species. The Zephyrians had been using forced labor for decades, something that made human anger burn even hotter. Martinez's troops fought through the station corridors with a fury that shocked their alien enemies. Ambassador Carter was found in the deepest part of the prison complex, badly injured but still alive. She had spent months as a captive watching the Zephyrians abuse other prisoners. When Martinez's soldiers carried her to safety, she whispered that the aliens were not just warriors, but slave masters who had conquered entire civilizations. This knowledge made the human cause feel even more justified. As victories mounted, other alien species began to take notice. The Ethereal Collective sent observers to study this new species that could match the feared Zephyrian war machine. The Machine consciousness calculated the probability of human success and found the number surprising. The Hive Confederacy watched with interest as their old enemies finally faced a real challenge. Dr. Foster's weapons became more sophisticated with each battle. She created smart missiles that could think for themselves and energy shields that adapted to enemy fire. But she also studied captured Zephyrian equipment to understand their weaknesses. Every piece of alien technology that fell into human hands became a tool for building better weapons to use against them. The war escalated as both sides committed more resources to the conflict. Human industrial capacity, dormant since the ancient world wars, emerged with terrifying efficiency. Entire planets converted to military production as billions of people worked to support the war effort. The Zephyrians began to understand they had awakened something far more dangerous than they had expected. Captain Susan Kelly's fleet started hunting Zephyrian supply convoys in deep space. Her ships would appear without warning, destroy their targets, and vanish back into the darkness between stars. The alien supply lines began to break down as more convoys failed to reach their destinations. Zephyrian commanders started demanding larger escorts for their cargo ships, which reduced the forces available for offensive operations, intercepted Zephyrian communications, began to show growing fear of human capabilities. The aliens call humanity the Firebloods because of their fierce determination in battle. They spoke of humans as creatures who burn with an inner flame that could not be extinguished. Every human victory came with a cost in Zephyrian morale. That went far beyond simple military defeat. The proud warrior race was learning what it meant to face an enemy that refused to give up. 2 years of brutal warfare had transformed the galaxy's balance of power in ways no one had expected. Captain Susan Kelly stood on the bridge of her flagship as human forces surrounded the Zephyrian Second Armada in the Nebula of Sorrows. Alien fleet was trapped with nowhere to run, and Kelly felt a cold satisfaction as she prepared to give the order that would destroy them completely. The Battle of Crimson Stars lasted 8 hours and ended with the complete annihilation of 60 Zephyrian warships. Kelly's forces used new tactics that shocked military observers from neutral species who were monitoring the conflict. Humans fought with a calculated fury that seemed to combine the best aspects of both emotion and logic. They were not wild berserkers, but disciplined soldiers who channeled their anger into devastating effectiveness. The Zephyrians began to understand they had made a terrible mistake at Concordia Station. Reports from their intelligence networks spoke of humans with growing terror. The aliens had expected to face another species like themselves, driven by honor and glory in battle. Instead, they found an enemy that fought for something much more dangerous: justice for the innocent dead and protection of those who could not protect themselves. Colonel Pete Johnson became famous throughout human space for his raid on the Zephyrian Weapons Depot at Proxima 7. His team infiltrated the heavily guarded facility not to steal weapons, but to turn the alien arsenal against their own fleet. The explosion that followed could be seen from 3 star systems away and destroyed military supplies worth more than some. Planets. Dr. Foster's research teams worked around the clock to stay ahead of Zephyrian adaptations to human tactics. Every captured piece of alien technology was studied and reverse engineered to create even more effective weapons. The humans were learning and improving at a rate that frightened their enemies. Each battle made them stronger, while the Zephyrians grew weaker from constant losses. But the true turning point came when Johnson's raiders captured a Zephyrian dreadnought intact. The massive ship had been disabled by human plasma mines and boarded before its crew could destroy the sensitive equipment inside. What Dr. Foster's team found in the ship's databanks changed everything humanity thought they knew about their enemy. The Zephyrian Empire was not the conquering force it appeared to be. Deep in the classified military files were records showing that the aliens were refugees fleeing from something even more terrible in the galactic core. Their aggression and expansion were driven not by strength, but by desperate fear of what was chasing them through space. Intelligence Officer Nancy Lee spent weeks translating the captured files and what she found painted a very different picture of the war. The Zephyrians had attacked humanity not from malice, but from panic. They needed to appear strong and victorious to keep their own people from losing hope. The massacre at Concordia had been a show of force, meant to intimidate other species who might challenge their claims of power. Admiral Kate Morris received the intelligence reports as she prepared the final assault on the Zephyrian homeworld. The human fleet had grown to over 800 ships, each one armed with weapons that could crack planets open. Morris had the power to end the alien empire forever, and she knew that billions of humans were counting on her to deliver justice for the murdered diplomats. The Zephyrian homeworld of Crexana hung in space before the human armada like a blue-green jewel surrounded by failing defensive satellites. The planet's shields flickered weakly as their generators struggled to maintain power after years of war. One command from Morris would begin the orbital bombardment that would reduce Zephyrian civilization to radioactive ash. But the intelligence files made Morris pause and think about what victory really meant. The Zephyrians were not evil monsters, but frightened people who had made terrible choices out of desperation. Their attack on human diplomats had been wrong and criminal, but it had come from fear rather than hatred. This knowledge created a burden of choice that Morris had not expected to carry. Reports from the surface showed Zephyrian civilians hiding in underground shelters as they waited for human vengeance to fall from the sky. Children sent primitive radio messages begging for mercy in broken human words they had learned from captured broadcasts. These were not the voices of conquerors, but of ordinary people caught up in decisions made by their leaders. General Richards argued for complete victory over the aliens who had started the war. The families of the dead demanded justice for their murdered loved ones. Patricia Walsh, whose husband Ben had died at Concordia, had traveled with the fleet to witness the Walsh final destruction of humanity's enemies. The easy path lay before Morris: orbital bombardment, invasion, and the total subjugation of the species that had wronged them. War Marshal Crexto sent a final transmission from the surface, asking for terms of surrender. His words were proud, but Morris could hear the desperation underneath them. The alien leader who had ordered the attack on human diplomats was now pleading for the lives of his people. He offered complete submission to human authority and promised that the Zephyrian Empire would serve humanity for as long as their species existed. Morris looked at the planet below and thought about the choice that would define not just the end of this war, but humanity's place in galactic civilization. She could choose the path of vengeance that every other species would understand and respect. Or she could choose something that had never been tried before in the history of known space. Something that might be seen as either the greatest wisdom or the greatest folly in human history. Admiral Kate Morris stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution as the most powerful human fleet ever assembled waited for her command. 800 warships surrounded the Zephyrian homeworld in perfect formation, their weapons charged and ready to deliver the final blow that would end an empire. The blue-green planet below looked peaceful from space, but Morris knew that billions of aliens were hiding underground, waiting for human justice to fall from the stars. Helen Davis had traveled from Earth to be present for this historic moment. She stood beside Morris watching the tactical displays that showed Zephyrian defenses failing one by one. The planet's shields were down to 30% power, and their orbital weapons platforms had been destroyed hours ago. Nothing stood between humanity and complete victory except the choice of whether to take it. The demands for total destruction echoed through every level of human society. Patricia Walsh stood in the observation deck wearing a black dress and holding a picture of her dead husband Ben. She had made the long journey from Earth to witness the moment when his killers would pay the ultimate price for their crimes. Around her stood other families of the Concordia victims, all waiting for the vengeance they had been promised. General Paul Richards presented the final military assessment to the assembled command staff. His voice was steady, but Morris could hear the anger that still burned in him after 2 years of war. The Zephyrians had started this conflict by murdering diplomats who had come in peace. They had enslaved other species and shown no mercy to those weaker than themselves. Justice demanded that they be completely destroyed. But Intelligence Officer Nancy Lee's report painted a more complex picture of the enemy they had defeated. The captured Zephyrian files told a story of a civilization running from something terrible. In the galactic core, their aggression had been born from desperation rather than evil. They had attacked humanity not because they were monsters, but because they were afraid of appearing weak to the force that was hunting them. Dr. Amanda Foster added her analysis of Zephyrian society based on 2 years of studying their technology and culture. The aliens were not natural conquerors, but farmers, artists, and scholars who had been forced into military service by their desperate leadership. The warrior culture they displayed was a mask worn to hide their fear from enemies and allies alike. Morris reviewed the intelligence one more time as she faced the most important decision in human history. The easy choice was revenge. Every military advisor supported it. Every family member of the dead demanded it. Every human colony that had lived in fear of Zephyrian attack expected it. Total orbital bombardment would solve the alien problem forever and establish humanity as a force no one would dare challenge. Commander Ryan Brooks, scarred from years of battle against Zephyrian forces, offered a different perspective. He had been in more fights with the aliens than any other human and had seen how they reacted when cornered. They fought desperately, but not with the fury of natural warriors. They fought like frightened people who had no choice but to keep fighting. Or face something worse than death. The communication channels carried reports from human forces throughout Zephyrian space. Other alien worlds were watching to see how humanity would handle victory. The ethereal collective, the machine consciousness, and the Hive Confederacy all had observers monitoring the situation. How humans chose to end this war would determine their reputation throughout the galaxy for generations to come. Morris thought about the principles that had guided humanity since they first reached for the stars. They had always believed in being better than their enemies, in showing mercy to those who could not defend themselves, in building rather than destroying when given the choice. But those principles had never been tested against such a clear demand for justice. War Marshal Crexto sent another transmission from the surface, his proud voice breaking as he begged for the lives of his people. The alien leader who had ordered the attack on human diplomats was offering complete surrender and eternal service to humanity. He promised that the Zephyrian Empire would become a vassal state that would never again threaten human interests. President Davis placed her hand on Morris's shoulder and spoke quietly about the choice they faced. Revenge would be satisfying and would send a clear message to potential enemies throughout the galaxy. But there was another path, one that no species in known galactic history had ever attempted at the moment of total victory. It would be dangerous, and many would call it foolish, but it might change everything. Morris looked at the faces around her and saw the weight of history in their eyes. The families of the dead deserved justice for their murdered loved ones. The soldiers who had fought and died in this war deserved to see their enemies punished. But Morris also thought about the Zephyrian children hiding in underground shelters and the possibility of creating something new from the ashes of war. The choice would define not just the end of this conflict, but humanity's place in galactic civilization. Morris could choose the path that every other species would understand and respect, or she could choose something unprecedented. Something that might be seen as either the greatest wisdom or the greatest mistake in human history. The decision was hers alone to make, and the entire galaxy was watching. Admiral Kate Morris took a deep breath and made the decision that would shock the galaxy. Instead of ordering the destruction of the Zephyrian homeworld, she activated the fleet communication system and broadcast a message that no one expected to hear. Her voice carried across space to the alien planet below, and to every ship in the human armada that had come expecting to deliver final vengeance. The words Morris spoke were simple but revolutionary. Humanity offered not conquest but cooperation. Not revenge but reconstruction. The human fleet that had come to destroy would instead begin delivering medical supplies, food, and engineering teams to help repair the damage caused by years of war. The species that had been wronged would become the species that offered aid to those who had wronged them. The reaction was immediate and explosive. General Richards demanded to know if Morris had lost her mind. Patricia Walsh collapsed in the observation deck, unable to process the idea that her husband's killers would be forgiven instead of punished. Half the human fleet commanders requested confirmation of orders that seemed to go against everything they had fought for during 2 years of brutal warfare, but Morris held firm in her decision, supported by President Davis, who understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. The human industrial capacity that had built warships began producing agricultural equipment and habitat modules instead. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had designed weapons to kill Zephyrians, now worked alongside their scientists to repair their failing infrastructure and power systems. The Zephyrian response was not gratitude but absolute terror. War Marshal Kreckstuhl and his advisors gathered an emergency session, trying to understand what the humans were actually planning. They could comprehend human rage because it matched their own capacity for violence when threatened. But forgiveness from a species they had wronged was completely beyond their psychological framework. Ambassador Lisa Carter, freed from Zephyrian captivity but bearing the physical and emotional scars of her imprisonment, became the face of human diplomacy once again. Her presence at the peace negotiations sent a message that even those who had suffered most were willing to work toward reconciliation. The sight of the tortured diplomat offering friendship to her former captors broke the minds of many Zephyrian leaders. The other galactic civilizations watched in fascination and growing alarm. The ethereal collective's observers reported that humanity had demonstrated something more dangerous than military might, the ability to transform enemies into allies through incomprehensible mercy. The machine consciousness calculated the strategic implications and found that forgiveness could be a more effective weapon than any bomb. Dr. Foster's joint research projects with Zephyrian scientists produced technological advances that surpassed anything either species could have achieved alone. But more importantly, they demonstrated that human forgiveness was not weakness, but a strategic advantage that could neutralize enemies more completely than any military victory. The aliens who had expected death found themselves in debt to those they had tried to destroy. Commander Ryan Brooks found himself working alongside former enemies to establish new protocols for contact between different species. The Zephyrian officers who had once shot his ships now served under his command in joint operations against a real threat from the galactic core. The transformation was so complete that observers from other species struggled to believe what they were seeing. Intelligence reports began flooding in from across the galaxy as other alien civilizations tried to understand the implications of human behavior. The Hive Confederacy's expansion plans stalled as they realized they could not predict how humans might respond to future aggression. The possibility that their enemies might forgive them and make them stronger was more terrifying than any threat of retaliation. The Zephyrians slowly began to understand that they had encountered something unprecedented in galactic history. Human forgiveness came not from weakness, but from a strength so complete that it could afford to be merciful. The species that could have destroyed them chose instead to heal them, creating a bond stronger than any alliance built on mutual fear. Or Advantage. War Marshal Kreckstuhl underwent the most dramatic transformation of all. The proud military leader who had ordered the massacre at Concordia found himself serving as a liaison officer in the new human Zephyrian alliance. His role was to help other alien species understand that cooperation with humanity was not surrender, but elevation to something greater than either civilization could achieve alone. The joint colonies established in former battle zones became symbols of what was possible when species chose growth over revenge. Human and Zephyrian families lived side by side, their children playing together while their parents worked on projects that benefited both civilizations. The very idea of such cooperation sent shockwaves through galactic society. As news of the human decision spread, other enslaved species in Zephyrian territory began to hope for the first time in generations. If the humans could forgive their enemies, perhaps there was a chance for everyone to build something better from the ruins of the old empire. The transformation of the Zephyrians from conquerors to partners offered a model that could change how conflicts were resolved throughout known space. The galaxy's balance of power shifted, not through conquest, but through the demonstration that there was an alternative to endless cycles of revenge and domination. Humanity had revealed something that threatened the foundation of how every other species understood interstellar relations, the possibility that conflicts could end in growth, rather than destruction. 5 years after the war's end, the galaxy had been transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Zephyrian-Human Alliance had become the most powerful force in known space, built not through conquest, but through a partnership that grew stronger with each passing day. Former enemies now worked together so seamlessly that younger members of both species could barely remember a time when their civilizations had been at war. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of a joint exploration vessel, watching as human and Zephyrian crews worked side by side to investigate unknown regions of space. Beside him, former War Marshal Krextel served as a tactical advisor, his forearms moving gracefully as he coordinated defensive systems. The alien who had once ordered the massacre at Concordia now dedicated his life to protecting human crews from the dangers of deep space. The technological advances achieved through cooperation had surpassed everyone's expectations. Dr. Amanda Foster's research teams, now including the brightest Zephyrian scientists, had developed faster than light communication systems and energy sources that made both civilizations nearly unstoppable. But the real breakthrough was not in technology, but in the discovery that two very different species could become stronger together than either had ever been alone. Ambassador Lisa Carter addressed the newly formed Galactic Council from the podium of what had once been a battlefield. Her scars from Zephyrian captivity were still visible, but her voice carried hope instead of bitterness as she spoke of second chances and the possibility that any conflict could be resolved through understanding rather than destruction. The concepts she presented were more alien to most species than any strange technology. The other galactic powers found themselves facing a situation they had never encountered before. The ethereal collective had planned to exploit the human Zephyrian conflict to expand their own territory, but instead they faced a united front that was diplomatically and militarily superior to anything they could field. Their traditional strategies of divide and conquer were useless against an alliance built on genuine mutual respect. The machine consciousness ran countless calculations trying to predict human behavior in future conflicts. Every scenario they modeled broke down when they tried to factor in the possibility of forgiveness. How could they plan military campaigns against an enemy that might choose to heal rather than harm? The uncertainty was so complete that they withdrew from several planned operations rather than risk unpredictable human responses. The Hive Confederacy faced the most serious challenge to their expansion since they had first reached the stars. Their entire civilization was built on the consumption and absorption of other species, but they discovered that humans and Zephyrians could not be consumed because they had learned to make each other stronger. The Alliance represented a form of evolution that the Hive found both fascinating and terrifying. Intelligence reports from across the galaxy showed the same pattern repeating wherever human influence spread. Species that had been enemies for generations began attempting diplomatic solutions to their conflicts. The example set by human forgiveness created a new model for how civilizations could interact, one that threatened to overturn thousands of years of galactic history. Commander Ryan Brooks established the first academy for interspecies relations on the former battlefield where he had once fought desperately against Zephyrian forces. Students from dozens of different civilizations came to study human methods of conflict resolution. The most popular course was titled Strategic Mercy and taught how forgiveness could be more effective than force in achieving long-term objectives. War Marshal Krextel became one of the Academy's most requested instructors, teaching classes on understanding the enemy mind from the unique perspective of someone who had been transformed from enemy to ally. His lectures drew students from across the galaxy who wanted to understand how humans had achieved something that violated every known principle of interspecies relations. The joint colonies established in former combat zones became showcases of what was possible when different species chose cooperation over competition. Human children played with Zephyrian youngsters, while their parents worked together on projects that benefited both civilizations. Visitors from other worlds watched in amazement as natural enemies treated each other like family members. But the true measure of the transformation became clear when the real threat from the galactic core finally arrived. The ancient enemy that had been chasing the Zephyrians across space emerged from the darkness between stars with a fleet designed to consume entire civilizations. What they found waiting for them was not the scattered refugee empire they had been hunting, but a unified alliance that fought with the combined strength of two species. The battle lasted 3 days and ended with the complete destruction of the core invaders. Human tactical flexibility combined with Zephyrian military precision created a fighting force that was far more effective than the sum of its parts. The victory was so overwhelming that other galactic powers began requesting alliance memberships, rather than risking human displeasure. As ambassador, Carter concluded her speech to the Galactic Council. She embodied humanity's most terrifying trait, the ability to see past immediate grievances to long-term possibilities. She spoke of building a galactic civilization based on cooperation rather than conquest, where conflicts could be resolved through understanding rather than violence. To species built on dominance hierarchies and zero-sum competition, these concepts were more threatening than any weapon. The assembled alien delegates listened in fascination and growing fear as Carter described the future where enemies could become friends and wars could end in growth rather than destruction. They had feared human rage because it was familiar, reflecting their own capacity for violence when threatened. But human forgiveness revealed something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that could grow stronger by transforming opponents into partners. In the end, the galaxy learned that monsters could be conquered through superior force, but saints could not be defeated because they refused to create enemies. Humanity had become the most dangerous species in known space not because of their weapons, but because of their ability to break the ancient cycles of revenge that had defined interstellar relations for millennia.